I'm just going to give folks a couple of minutes to log in, and then we'll get started in a couple of seconds. All right. All right. Well, good evening, everyone. Welcome to the Eastville 2040 Clear Vision Speaker Series. Tonight's speaker is Dr. John Arroyo, who will be talking about creative placemaking and suburban change. Tonight's program, just going to do some quick introductions, and then we'll get into a quick overview of what the Eastville 2040 plan is, and then a couple of next steps. Then I'll turn it over to John, who will be talking about creative placemaking and suburban change. And then we'll open it up for Q&A after that. If you have any questions now, or if you have any questions or comments you want to leave, you can go ahead and leave those in the Q&A box, or you can raise your hand and we can call on you, and you'll be able to voice your comments or your questions directly to us. On the city side staff, we have Gina Gibson-Williams, who is our Community Development Director. She will be available to answer any questions or chime in as necessary. Then I'm Gustavo Gonzalez, the Planning Manager for the City of Eastville. On the project consultant side, we have Mark Teague, who is our Project Manager for the General Plan Update. He's with PlaceWorks, and Bob Starks, who is our Environmental Impact Report Project Manager with Michael Baker International, and then Susan Harding, who is with Circle Point, who is our Outreach Consultant. So before we get into the Eastville 2040 plan, I just wanted to quickly touch upon our core values for this program. And I'll just go ahead and read these. These are: discover Eastville's potential, capture Eastville's imagination, represent your community, and shape Eastville's expectations. So these are the values we want to make sure that we're held to. These are the values we're going to go back to when everything is said and done, and ensure that our vision, our policies, and our goals are aligned with these values. The Eastville 2040 plan. So if you're not familiar with what a general plan is or what a general plan update is, no problem, we've got you covered. We're just going to do a quick crash course on what that is, but it's often described as the constitution for a city's development. It is a foundation upon which all development decisions are based. It brings the community together to develop a shared vision for the next 25 to 35 years. And it guides future actions by establishing priorities, policies, and goals. And it sets the tone for development of land and protection of people and resources. It's also something that we have to be in compliance with state law. We do have 8 required chapters as part of the general plan. Those include land use, circulation, housing, noise, conservation, safety, open space, and environmental justice. We could add additional ones to those, but those are the minimum required by state law. But this is where it all starts. When a property wants to be, somebody proposes to develop a piece of property in the city of Eastville, what happens is we look at the general plan designation for that property and determine whether it's residential, commercial, industrial, open space, what have you, and just ensure that whatever's in front of us and being proposed is consistent with that vision and those policies and those goals, and is consistent with the general plan. We've done quite a bit of outreach already with this program. We have the Engage Eastville website, which essentially is a portal for everything related to this project. You want to stay connected with that website and be able to go on that website to be able to leave a comment and continue to see any new information related to this program and this project. You will be able to access that through this website. In addition to that, we've done about almost 20 interviews with community champions. Those champions are folks in the community who are seen as leaders. And basically ask them questions as to how do you see Eastville now, and where do you see it going in the future? And then all that gets folded into an outreach report that essentially gives us a clearer vision into what the community is telling us in terms of what they want to see with this program. And then finally, our Clear Vision speaker series, that's what we're in now. We're in our 6th and final one. Those were kicked off back in November, and the first session was with Chris Danley, who talked about mobility and health. It was followed up with Victor Dover, who talked about community design. Then that was followed up with Shanika Johnson, who talked about diversity and inclusion. Then Dan Paralick, who talked about housing and the missing middle. And finally, we heard last from Joe Minicosi, who talked about economic development and dollars and cents of community building. And so now, this is a word cloud that essentially just pulls out words that we've been hearing from the community. And I won't read them all, but in essence, what we're hearing is that folks are looking for places to congregate. They're looking for housing. They're looking for mixed use places to socialize, and they want that to be walkable and tight and knit and a destination. So this plan essentially will set the tone for that, and the Leo property being a perfect example of where that can happen. In terms of schedule and process, I just want to quickly touch upon that. We are in the final session of the speaker series. We are going to be wrapping that up tonight, and then getting into drafting. We're already drafting sections of the general plan. That will be followed up with the kickoff of the environmental impact report that will analyze all of the various impacts that would be associated with build out of the general plan, and then those would be analyzed and then provided to the community so that we can see what kind of impacts we need to be mitigating for as part of this program. So with that, I want to turn it over to Dr. John Arroyo, and I'll just quickly introduce him. John is a national expert in the field of equitable creative placemaking, cultural and municipal arts planning, suburban diversity, and new immigrant destinations. He has over 20 years of experience as a cultural planner and consultant for various cities, counties, local arts agencies, and has served as lead advisor for the National Endowment for the Arts and philanthropic organizations. He is an assistant professor in engaging diverse communities at the University of Oregon. So with that, please help me welcome Dr. John Arroyo to the program. I'll go ahead and stop sharing here, and you can share your screen, John.
Hi, everyone. Let me just get this set up here. Let's see. Can you see the screen there? Okay, sounds good. Thank you to everyone at the City of Eastvale for inviting me to be a part of the Clear Vision series. And I want to just start by saying how forward-thinking I think it is that a city would do something like this for residents to get more involved. I think many times when cities are going through general plan updates or any kind of large-scale planning process, we're so busy in everything that it takes to do that big plan that we might not even think about how to do extra things to reach residents that may not very well be able to come to the meetings or participate otherwise. And so I was telling several planner friends that I was doing this, and everyone had the same reaction, which was, we've never seen a city actually do so much for their residents to learn these things if they don't know those things already. And so in some ways, I teach an introductory course for planning for graduate students, and for residents watching, I think it's very much like a similar thing for you to be able to do that without having to pay for tuition credits or do homework. So I think that's something really great. And I want to thank everyone at the City of Eastvale for coordinating this, especially Susan for inviting me and finding me. When Susan talked to me about presenting on this topic, I thought to myself, I definitely am the right person for this, given what I'm going to talk about today and just my general expertise in planning and culture. So today I'll be talking about creative placemaking and suburban change, and you'll see my eyes sort of go through both of my monitors as I go through my notes. And I've got a lot of great images, and basically what I've done is I've thought a lot about different projects that would relate to Eastvale and what Eastvale looks like and where Eastvale is striving to go to, especially with their general plan update. I'm actually really familiar with Eastvale because I'm from Southern California. I'm from East LA, but I was telling Susan when we first spoke about this that most of my research in teaching looks at changing suburbs and the role of art and culture in cities. And I've been mixing both of those more and more. And when I had to do a dissertation for my PhD, it wasn't in Los Angeles and I was in Boston. I looked at Eastvale as a case to look at how cities are managing demographic changes and difference. The only reason I ended up studying Atlanta and the only reason I didn't study Eastvale was because I was forced in a good way to explore an area that I'm not from and don't know already. And so I ended up in the US South. And so, so most of what I'll be talking about today comes with an understanding of the general built environment and the newness of Eastvale, not historically, but in terms of incorporation and in the ways that we're trying to grow and manage that growth. So this is just a question for everyone who's watching, residents of Eastvale. Just think to yourself, how many of you would consider yourself an artist? And along the same lines, how many of you would consider yourselves creative? And when you see those two questions, you probably think to yourself, are they one and the same? Um, why is it so important to differentiate the differences between being an artist or art and creativity, or even the word culture? We tend to group all of those together. And my presentation will show a lot of really great case studies that pertain and really respond to specific to suburban change in Eastvale. And I hope that what we'll go through tonight will help city planners, other city staff, and residents think about the vision they would like to have for Eastvale themselves. How many of you watching could name an artist if it wasn't yourself, or another creative person in Eastvale? Um, how many of you can think of someone who's a neighbor or a friend or a coworker who's mentioned that they've done creative culture making in some way or another, even if they didn't have an arts degree, which is actually one of the fun parts about creative placemaking, as we'll soon see. And so my overview for today's presentation, what I'm going to do is give you, I'm going to start with just a general background of my own personal and professional sort of coming to this topic over the last 20 years. And then I want to go through an overview of what creative placemaking is and what separates it from traditional arts and cultural work, because it's a very specific movement in the planning and development field in the last 10, 15 years. Then I'll talk about some trends in the changing American suburbs, and show you some examples of sort of where Eastvale fits in and how some of those cities are responding to a big growing boom, a big growing population boom, and also a quest and an interest to maybe establish gateways or other kinds of creative aspects to the city. The majority of this presentation will really center on sort of situating Eastvale and looking at the research methods I went through. I went through about a little over 12,000 cases over the last few weeks that have been approved creative placemaking grants from various funders. And the reason why I'm staying within the last 10 years specifically is because I think we've seen some of the best practices and the cases that I think will best serve Eastvale moving forward as examples. And then I'll get into 5 key themes that I was able to pull from looking at all that grant paperwork and all those grant summaries. And those will be infused and illustrated with many case studies. I'll wrap up with looking at key lessons for what Eastvale city planners and residents can think about moving forward in terms of the future of creative placemaking. And then I'll wrap up with questions. So I've got a large slide deck, and I will, I put more cases than I'll actually be able to go through, only for the sake of preserving examples that you can draw on later if you refer to the presentation. So I grew up in East Los Angeles, which is a very urban area in Los Angeles, and it is maybe about 10 minutes from downtown Los Angeles. There weren't a lot of arts and cultural centers in the area. It was unincorporated county area, so we weren't an incorporated city. My mom was a school teacher, and she was very interested in arts and culture and just free events that she would get invited to as a teacher. She would hear about things at the library. And so early on, despite other challenges the neighborhood had, my focus really was looking at this one building. At the end of my block, there was this 2-story building. It kind of dilapidated in some ways, but an artist had come in and had done a mosaic tile work. If anyone's familiar with Antoni Gaudí, famous artist from Barcelona, and did all the sculpture parks there, it was similar in that same tradition. And so you'll see a lot of broken glass. And I thought, oh, that's kind of a nice way of repurposing this building. It ended up being a Mexican-American cultural center. It was really well known with printmakers, people doing poster art. They had a lot of events there as well. And I would walk past this building. I just lived right behind it. I would walk past this building twice a day on my way to school, and it stayed with me as a place that had a lot of other challenges. This was something that really stuck out. It was, if someone said, what's a landmark in your area? I'd say, oh, it's Self-Help Graphics and Art, the name of this space. And you'll see here, there was a really famous mural, a recreation of a mural from a famous Mexican muralist. If anyone has spent time near Union Station, you'll be familiar with El Pueblo, the historical landmark area there, and there's a recreation of the mural there as well. Another thing I would pass would be this large mural here at the local library, which was just down the block. Anthony Quinn, the famous actor, was from the area, and so the library was named after him. And so vividly, I thought, you know, before I even knew sort of the importance of murals and sort of broken glass, mosaic glass in Mexican culture, this was sort of ever present. Outside of this one block that I lived on, you would be hard pressed to find a lot of formal cultural venues. And it wasn't until I was older that I was able to explore more of Southern California that I started going to other museums and things like that, these types of venues that were much more formal, but deep down in my mind, I could think of family members or neighbors or other people who did cultural work, but maybe would never call themselves an artist or a cultural worker. They would say, oh, I make baskets, or I do embroidery, I do something, but no, like I'm not a creative person. This is just what I do on my own time. Um, um, that would spark a whole sort of 20 years, last 2 decades of work. I've worked for nonprofits, I've worked for cities, I've worked for various foundations and local governments. All across the US and internationally. And then I became a professor. And I got really interested in thinking about the role of how suburbs started to change, you know, and how cities were reacting to that suburban change, especially with the last 2 censuses that were showing more and more people were moving to the suburbs. These were the fastest growing areas, the areas that needed a lot more attention and research and resources, but because planning can have a very urban bias, we tend to forget those areas. And the 21st century will very much be an area where places like Eastvale really shine, and more people move there from the larger cities like Riverside or Los Angeles than they do leave it. Over the last 20 years, I've spent time being a reviewer.
And then they, you know, either I provide them with an estimate.
Oh, hello. Oh, sorry. I heard a crosstalk. Over the last 20 years, I've spent being a reviewer for national grant making organizations. I've been a site reviewer, I've been a grant reviewer, I've been an advisor, I've been a technical assistant consultant, I've been a grant maker and a grant writer. And so what you'll see tonight is really 20 years of experience being able to kind of think very specifically about Eastvale and places like Eastvale. And when I worked at the LA County Arts Commission, the county arts agency for all of LA County, a lot of my early work was helping cities develop municipal cultural plans, whether they wanted to do artist housing or something else related to that. And then later it sparked more interest in public art and Percent for Arts programs, and starting new museums and the management of cultural facilities in smaller cities. And so I've been with this movement when we didn't know what to call it. In the early 90s, and late 90s, it was just arts and cultural planning. Later, it would change and people would call it maybe public art or creative economy. In 2010, we got to this term called creative placemaking, which was something the entire industry working in planning and art decided was a very specific term and very specifically defined. So let's get into it a little bit more. So looking at creative placemaking, the first place to start is the word creative. And we all define creativity differently. Some people would say art and culture are a form of creativity. Others might say in the 21st century, people who make apps is a form of creativity. For others, specific traditional foodways is a form of creativity. When we think about how the National Endowment for the Arts, the federal arts agency for the United States, this is how we look at what the span of arts is. If you were filling out an NEA application for an arts grant, you would have to select which one of these categories you would fall under. And so it could be everything from musical theater or opera to visual art or folk art or literature, dance, or theater. And so that span is really broad. And sometimes I think that actually makes it really difficult for people to kind of try to understand where they fit in, because more and more people working in this field are seeing people blur the lines, and not everyone wants to fill out multidisciplinary, but people are trying to say, well, it's a mixture of visual art and theater. And so we're starting to see things that we've not seen before in other places, which is really great movement. Before some of the standard foundations that started giving money for creative placemaking started in 2010, places like Art Place America or the Kresge Foundation starting a new initiative on that. I had worked on some research where in 2007-8, various foundations were interested in seeing what's the future of people making art in cities. And we thought we were going to find more people doing work in museums or operas or these kinds of venues. And what we ended up finding were people wanted to do work outside, outside of the four walls boundaries, outside of formal venues, sometimes not even run by arts organizations. Some of it was really ad hoc. And so that got us thinking at the role of place in creative placemaking. And when we think of what makes a good place, various planners and sociologists and people who spend their time observing social interaction have thought of different metrics. We can look at someone really famous, Jean Gell, from Copenhagen, and he gets hired a lot at cities to do these evaluations of what public space exists in the area and how to improve that. And it's a method that has been tried and true and has worked in a lot of places. So he'll just, and his team will spend a lot of time just at plazas and parks watching how people interact. Are they strolling? Are they sitting? Are they standing? Are they active? Are they sedentary? How did they get there? And so we've got a whole range of those kinds of activities. In the same way now in planning, we don't even just look at recreation. Is it passive recreation? Is it active recreation? Another organization that has done a lot of work in trying to define what a good place means is Project for Public Spaces. They're a group based out of New York, and here you can see in their What Makes a Great Place wheel here some of the key attributes that make this really important. And some of this came up in what Gustavo was mentioning earlier in the word cloud. Is there a place in the city that people can go to at night, evening use? Is there a place people can go to support local businesses? Is it fun? Is it active? Is it celebratory? Is it green? Is it walkable? Is it attractive? Is it proximate? Do you have to drive really far in your car? Could you just walk 10 minutes and actually get to this place? And so when we think about defining and putting both the words creative and place together, we get this general definition of creative placemaking, projects where art and culture play a really key role, an intentional role in something that's place-based, that's human-centered, that's specific to the local area. That might mean using local artists, that might mean partnering with local businesses. And the reason why it's really intentional to center art and culture here is because many times in the last 20 years, we've seen many projects say art and culture, if we have time, if there's extra money, if there are extra resources, and it ends up falling off largely general plans and other major initiatives that are changing the city. And from a creative placemaking perspective, we're saying, art and culture are not an extra, it's an actual key component to a high quality of life in any community. We all need places to express ourselves. Here during COVID, right, we've seen lots of museums and cultural spaces shutter. And their entire existence has been, getting a lot of people in a small space to be able to enjoy a cultural tradition or see a piece of artwork. And we're not able to do that now. But as we're all still at our homes, we're all really hungry for making these connections with people in place, and brings in creative placemaking at the forefront of all that. I teach a class called Creative Placemaking at the University of Oregon. And when we start out in my class, this is my definition of what creative placemaking is. And I've rewritten this many times over. I say, well, it is about art and culture, and it is about being community engaged, but it's bigger than artists. You don't have to call yourself an artist. You can be a culture bearer, cultural producer, whatever people want to call themselves. We're less interested in the actual term, but we want to make sure that this all gets down to physical, social, and economic health, and how we improve that. And so when you think of a general word cloud that might come from early examples of when we were trying to figure this out in like 2008 and 9, I was part of these national conversations, and the word community really stuck out. This was a really important aspect of that. Other things that came out here were like community identity, right? And the role of neighborhoods. People started saying, cities tend to have districts that are like arts districts, but how do we try to infuse that in other parts that's not just focused in maybe 2 or 3 blocks or in maybe 2 or 3 buildings? Um, Another really important component of creative placemaking was the role of equity, trying to make sure, well, we don't just want to get creative individuals involved and it be about place and local connections, but we also want to make sure that we're able to include so many other people that maybe aren't part of that conversation that really have something to contribute. What I found in the last 20 years, there's some communities that have had the last remaining person doing a certain kind of art making or tradition, and all of that is in their hands. Trying to make a connection to that was really important. If we break it down in 3 key words, I'd say creative placemaking is about people and space and art. And at the center, that's where we get creative placemaking. If you wanted to think about it in terms of something maybe a little bit more broader, you would say, well, creative placemaking is about culture. So there's a place for focusing on how cultural development, public art, murals, these kinds of things might work. But it's also about community development that could be about art, but it doesn't have to be. Social services, bringing in anything from homelessness to health and human services, aging populations, any of those services. And people will say, hey, wait, how does aging have anything to do with the role of creative placemaking? And I'll show you in a bit. It also had to do with focusing on what we already have. Many times the conversation about cultural assets and communities, time and time again, having worked with many cities, will be, we don't have this and we don't have that. But I tend to start at the asset-based approach saying, well, let's not look at deficits. Let's start at what we know we already have. This is a plus, and this is a plus, and this is a plus. And let's actually just try to highlight that even more than sort of hide it or not realize it's as important as it really is. about economic development. So creative placemaking brings people to different festivals. Sometimes they're fixed, sometimes they're ephemeral, a one-time event, but it brings in tourism money, it brings in money to local businesses. It helps keep a really healthy economy. And then it's about having this place-based connection and the importance of that. And so some general examples before we get into some of the key case studies. When we look at up here in my upper right, it might be your left. This is the Ajo School, the Curly School in Ajo, Arizona. So this was an old school, an abandoned school that there were three native tribes in this region in southern Arizona, and they banded together to restore the school and make them artist residences. And so it's artist live work space. It's had multiple phases. It's a real favorite in the creative placemaking movement because we end up seeing all these buildings that get torn down, and they said, wait, the heritage here is important, but there are also new populations living here, also existing populations, and we all want to work together to save this property. Here we can see the Festival of Masks in LA, right? So, you know, the ephemeral nature of festivals, right? It brings in a lot of people, a lot of vendors. It's really celebratory. It's something people look forward to. Sometimes there's a fixed component to that, but not always. Maybe there's a related, you know, museum of masks or anything like that to the specific holiday. Here in Salt Lake County, in the suburban area of Salt Lake County here, there was a new refugee population from Bhutan who would say when the city started doing their cultural plan updates, oh, no, 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 we're not creative. All we do is grow this really unique food and we have these different cultural traditions that are culinary. And everyone's like, wait, wait, it's that, let's talk about that. And they were like, oh, well, we teach, you know, younger generations. These are all things that were available to us in our countries that we didn't have here. So we've started these community gardens. We do all these religious festivals around that. That's a great example of creative placemaking. Something more simple in this suburban area of Minneapolis, Art Box in Bloomington, Minneapolis, they put a bike path near a large park and they just started painting all these. They got local artists to come in. They would rotate these. Some of them took sort of the form of graphic novels. Other ones were more portraits. Other ones were historical, looking at important people in that community. Um, in an area that I've studied in suburban Atlanta that's very similar to Eastvale, Gwinnett County, a lot of new immigrants that have been moving to the area have looked at their own cultural traditions, and they wouldn't call it creative placemaking, but it definitely was looking at a sense of place creatively. How developers there are looking at abandoned malls that were abandoned during the Great Recession and now turning them into facades that are more colonial facades with like a Latin American flair. And they also did the same on the interior here. So you go there and you feel like maybe you're walking through an old city of colonial Mexico. At the end of my block in East LA, here was a grandmother who just liked all these pink flamingos and blue flamingos and all these birds. And she set this up in her front yard. And every time I walked by, I was like, wow, this house really sticks out. Another one does something with brooms, right? And so it really sticks out as a cultural marker. Here in Holyoke in Massachusetts, you see there's a food culture here connected with all of these new immigrants that are moving here or people leaving hurricane areas like Puerto Rico. And so there's a whole connection with the building of this house and different traditions and colors and textures. And you'll see like the mural up here too. And this is in a more rural area, so they don't necessarily have to do that. They could have just built, you know, the barn and the area for the crops without having to think about the cultural connection, but that was really important to them. Here in Logan Park, there's a freeway in an area in San Diego that went through and decimated a community. And the community dealt a lot with the scar of that. And they decided, you know, we can either just have this concrete or we can color it. We can put on murals. We can use it for preservation. We can use it for cultural festivals. And we can work with that now as an asset. It's unfortunate that this has happened, but this is something that we can actually use. The freeway's not going to go down and we can rethink this. When we think about creative placemaking, what's also really important is to think about the different ways different sectors connect with creative placemaking. And we usually call that the matrix. We had sort of this bingo card that we would look at and we said, well, if we're thinking and with early creative placemaking and we still do this kind of work, different communities will fill this out and they'll say, okay, if I thought about the connection with agriculture and food and faith-based groups, is there a group in our community that does that kind of work? Is there a group in our community that does education work with, commercial, with independent business owners that has an arts component, right? The same way, is there someone in housing that does work with philanthropy and there's an art project coming out of there? And slowly we started to see all of these cross-sector connections. And we started doing work on what the intersection was between art and culture and housing, art and culture and transportation, in all of these 10 different things. I ended up doing my own creative placemaking grant in 2013, where I developed a card game. I'd been doing a lot of work on the Los Angeles River and the River Master Plan, and wrote a grant and got $175,000 to try to teach people how to get down to the LA River, how to use the LA River, what the cultural assets of the LA River were. And we played it like an actual large format card deck, which was really fun. We printed several hundred, we distributed it, and we had 52 weeks. There were 52 cards in a card deck. There are 52 miles on the LA River. There are 52 weeks in a year. And so over a year, we taught people every weekend on every mile, we had a different event, from tours. They were all creative placemaking events, different picnics, nighttime bands, dance events, other things like this. And so it was really famous, and it was really a wonderful opportunity to get people to kind of learn how to do that. And everyone said, John, you were interested in the river and you went and you did all of this. You didn't have to do that. And I thought, no, I didn't have to do that, but I needed a way, and placemaking was the way to get people to reappropriate a really bad relationship they had with the LA River and now change that. Why East Vale is really important in the scheme of Southern California is because of the movements that we have now with suburban demographic change. And when we look at where new populations are moving to, historically, we would look at something like this. This was an old model in sociology that comes up a lot, and this is sort of Sociology 101. And this is most of cities that were sort of industrialized cities in the Midwest or the East Coast were sort of the large capture areas for new immigrants. And so this is the loop in Chicago. And what was interesting is early researchers who were looking at immigrant settlement would say, oh, well, everyone comes to the center, people start moving. And here's a Chinatown, and so it's not in the center. Here's Little Sicily, Italians, here's Deutschland, the German area. And then as we move further and further out, we get to this area called single family dwellings, which what we know as now as suburbs. What's interesting about East Vale to me is that maybe at one point, areas in that part of Riverside County may have been thought of suburbs of Los Angeles, only because people in Southern California were known to drive so far. But Riverside has grown so much, it's very much more a suburb of Riverside than it is a suburb of Los Angeles, unless people are driving that same length, right? And so it makes us rethink sort of the positioning of the importance of where those partners are for types of creative placemaking projects. Um, Southern California and all of the research that has been done about growing, changing suburbs really fits into a post-World War II suburb where sort of a newer gateway area, we're now like the Midwest or the East Coast, 50s, 60s, 70s, and more so the 90s than ever before, sort of started changing the way we thought about the census. And people were leaving large cities. They were inaffordable, they didn't have the space, they wanted more housing, more affordable housing, and they found other places in Riverside and San Bernardino and neighboring counties. Here was a study about where cities and suburbs growth is. And most people were looking at this. I had studied Atlanta and I was looking a lot at where all this growth was. And here we said, okay, there's more growth in suburbs than cities, like Los Angeles, as we see here in the red circle. In some places, there were more growth in cities than suburbs, but it wasn't as much as the growth of suburbs than cities. This is an area that I've studied so much in Atlanta, and it's called Gwinnett County. And very much like Eastvale, in the early 90s, it was very rural, mostly agricultural, not a lot of housing. Now it's a lot of housing. There's been a big boom. The county went from 70,000 people to nearly 1 million people, and a good sort of mix of different ethnic demographics. We see sort of an older sort of Gwinnett County now, old housing, sort of old Main Street USAs, but we also see sort of the toll of the Great Recession and the many ways that has sort of affected all of this. Another area that I've spent a lot of time looking at is an area called Will County, very much like Riverside County where Eastvale is, where in the 90s it was historically mostly rural, and then it started building a lot of housing. It has become a big shipping center, big logistics area, large growth of the sort of types of jobs in Chicago. And so you've seen a hunger for figuring out where the center is and where that kind of work can happen. And you've seen everything from creative placemaking coming in sort of old car gatherings to even how people build parks together and the roles that people bring that with them. When we think about arts and culture in Eastvale, what's interesting to me is thinking about assets broadly defined. And so here's a mural that people may have seen, and I know this won an award. And looking at this, when I saw this, I thought, okay, this tells me a lot about Eastvale. This tells me there's some historic structures here. We see this old structure here. I say, well, there's definitely an agricultural history here. There's a native tribal history here. There's likely some other kind of social civic service history that might be important. This looks like a quinceañera here. This looks like right here, a cultural center here, the Art in the Park events that Eastvale presents. And so as we look at that, that wasn't a mistake, right? The artist here building this, trying to create this and saying, these are the images of Eastvale, you know? And so as you look at this, I'd say, well, dairy history seems really important, indigenous history, something maybe about river traditions, and maybe what are the traditions that are not necessarily public? What are things that are parts of people who are residents who are not necessarily getting illuminated, right? And so thinking about that, I'll go into my research methods and talk to you about some specific case studies that I think can help Eastvale and residents think about its future. And so what I ended up doing to gather these case studies was sort of going deep down in my head and really thinking about, 1,200 funded creative placemaking projects over the last 10 years. I wanted to highlight best practices, things that would specifically fit the strategic plan. I looked at local news for more context, most of the local newspapers in some of these areas where I was able to go through, looking at it through the lens of suburban areas that were going through major demographic change. I was looking at a large literature review and looking at what people have written about creative placemaking in suburban areas, whether that was professional reports, white papers, scholarly work. And I developed a thematic typology of about 5 key themes that really jumped out and sort of tied all of these projects together. And I wrote a standardized set, a template of some mini case studies that I'll show you in a bit. And looking at really small scale things, case studies that I thought, these are easy entry points, and easy entry points isn't a bad thing. It's actually a really great thing. Some of my favorite creative placemaking projects have not been the ones that have been funded at 500,000, though that would be great, right? Or $1 million, but what people could do with 50 or 80,000, especially starting out with thinking about the role of placemaking in their creative plans. And I'll end with giving you some recommendations. And so the key areas that I looked at were 8 key funders. The main funders for placemaking are really this group here. We look at the National Endowment for the Arts and our Art Town program, and then the Art Place America. They recently sunset. They were just around for 10 years, but they had a National Creative Placemaking Fund, and they funded over 600 different grants all across the country, geographically distributed. The Surdna Foundation and the Kresge Foundation have changed their grant making all for arts and culture to be about creative placemaking. And it's one of the reasons why my emphasis on the presentation is about placemaking and less about general arts and culture for arts and culture's sake. A lot of times artists will ask me in smaller cities, I'm an artist that isn't necessarily interested in community transformation. Um, what is the role for me? And I'd say, oh, they're independent artist grants. But the state of Connecticut completely gave all of their grant money, and they transformed their state arts agency to only give money to creative placemaking projects. And so in my mind, that's sort of where the ball is rolling, and where I would have cities sort of come in and say, really think about it from that perspective, because that's where all of the framing is happening. However, if someone says, I do ceramics, and there's definitely nothing wrong with someone says, I just want to do that in my studio without the community transformation, that would be a different set of resources. Other groups here, the Irvine Foundation here in California, well, I'm in Oregon, but they're in California, the Department of Education and the Department of Housing, even in some of their strategic plans for specific zones, promise zones focused on schools, or the Choice Neighborhoods program that HUD did, focused on new public housing, all of them started looking at cultural elements. And I thought that was really key and important. So let's dig into some of these. So one of the first trends that I looked at was how smaller suburban areas were starting to use creative placemaking projects to repurpose underutilized spaces. And so this was really important because around 2010, after the Great Recession, a lot of suburban areas had extra excess office space, or they had just maybe abandoned housing. They needed to figure out what to do with that, maybe older industrial buildings that were part of the core center of the town before it really expanded to other areas. And so one project that really stuck out in the large survey that I did there was We Art Wheaton. This was located in suburban Washington, D.C. in Montgomery County, and it was led by the Arts and Humanities Council of Montgomery County. It got about $50,000 from an Art Town grant in 2015, and they leveraged that money with another $170 million with the redevelopment district there. And the main thing here was really looking at their arts and entertainment district. They had established an area, but they didn't have a plan for what to do in that area. Several blocks in downtown with some new buildings that was commercial and some housing around that. And so they went and they drew upon artists, and they needed to think about what their town square was. And their town square wasn't old, it was a newer area. And so what they did was they outlined that area, and they did this larger sort of visioning process. And similar to the word cloud that Gustavo showed earlier, people were like, wow, we really want to think about revitalizing this space. We really want to think about this space as a destination. And so they have been going on with this for a while, and they've been doing really well. They established a public art installation, so they've done a call to artists, and they've been able to do this with a small amount of money. What artists can do with $200, with $50, with $350 or $1,200 is really fantastic. And so here they were able to get artists to do some work on creative placemaking that looked at sense of place, even murals on plywood walls or sort of removable murals. Some of these have turned out this way, where now they're able to give tours in some parts of the city, and these murals will rotate. Some of these murals have happened on abandoned storefronts in some of or even just vacant windows that need some type of dressing. They started an arts parade here. Started really small. This was in 2017, and it was just a 3-block difference radius here. Later, that kept growing and growing, and you'll see that their partners started growing more and more, you know, from the Westfields Mall to even the local arts and culture agencies. More food involved, all of those types of things, right? They were able to establish a gallery in one of the abandoned storefronts and be able to use that as a way for artists to display their work, but also for the city to start developing a roster of artists that they can draw on for other public art projects. And so that was really key and important. And so when we look at We Art Wheaton now, we have this growing sense of identity in an area that was searching for it, but it sort of became horse before the cart because the city didn't really have a plan for that until they started looking at creative placemaking projects, and they were able to do this type of work. So here's some of the public art that is sort of come from that and that tour that's continuing on. When they established their input to inform the strategic plan here, they had 6 key goals. And the city of Wheaton was really interested in making sure that there was something unique about the place, the city, that people would be attracted even from outside of the area, that whatever happened with creative placemaking would start strengthening the infrastructure of artists and start inviting other artists to say, hey, that's actually a place that cares about the arts and we can actually live there and do this work. It started catalyzing tourism and community creative economies and even community revitalization. Um, Another project that looked at repurposing underutilized space was in San Leandro in the suburban area of the Bay Area. This was a project called Soul Society. And this was a project that used performance art to do vocational training, job training for youth, mostly a growing Asian population, Asian American and Asian immigrant population. This got about $75,000 in 2015 from the NEA, from the Art Town program. And their success of the program, actually, they had some settlement funds from a tobacco suit in 1617, and they got another $350,000 as the fund was trying to figure out how to do community benefit. What was interesting about this, there was a lot of transnational connection with the countries where people were from and this new growing immigrant population here. Students were learning job techniques, learning how to use sort of certain kind of computer software, other things like that. And they started a community newspaper. They started doing smaller events here to actually start showing the different kinds of cultural traditions in this soul society sphere that the youth had, what they could do. And so everything from hip hop to other kinds of performances. And it became a place for youth to be able to gather. Youth would look forward to this. In a lot of areas that are booming suburban areas, what you have is actually a really large youth population. It's areas with larger houses. Families are growing really quickly, and it's one of the reasons they've actually selected that, the quality of life in these areas as opposed to, you know, more denser urban centers. And so their key takeaway here was really thinking about how they could partner with social services to really ramp up and think about art not just as the extra, but as the whole sort of package. But they also realized working with youth actually would take a little bit of time, but that was worth it in getting the city to actually contribute more money down the line later and seeing, okay, the value of art here is really strong. A second theme that we saw going through this was looking at the sort of cultural and vocational support for artists. And so thinking about the native history of the Tongva and Gabrielino there in Eastvale and the Inland Empire in general, this is the Catawba Cultural Preservation Project. This is in Rock Hill, South Carolina. It's in suburban Charlotte, and it's run by the Catawba Indian Nation. And what they were really interested here in 2015, they got $50,000 to look at tribal artisans. They knew that there was a small population there of the tribe and that they were doing work and preserving their culture, but they really needed a way to kind of show other people who weren't part of the tribe how to connect to that. And so they were able to utilize a few other funds, the First Peoples Fund for Native Artists, and actually get into and do more work. So they would do these big fairs, these big art fairs, but they would also do these artisan fairs along the way. And the artisan fairs were able to kind of help people kind of understand, because you can actually do a workshop with them. What was really fascinating about this is the way the city there in Rock Hill and sort of the surrounding area sort of learned more about the history of the Catawba people, and maybe figure out also ways that they can sort of get involved in more, even starting setting up shops in the downtown area, in the district there, and even thinking larger about cultural districts, right? You know, and the ways in which they can preserve something that was dying out, but really important for that region. Um, Another way that the theme of culture and vocational artist support has really stuck out here is actually not too far from you in Studio 395 in Lake Elsinore, suburban Riverside. This was using ceramics and woodworking and metalsmithing. There's only $25,000 grant from the NEA as well in 2016. And the only matching support they got here was in-kind support from Riverside County. But this really looked at health and wellness, because similar to Eastvale, people were like, we want to get outside of our houses. We want to be able to have places to go to. They had a growing Latino population there too. And so they were worried about maybe agricultural workers or the health conditions that they might be going through. And so they established and they started building all this sort of makeshift public art for a lot of their festivals, these big kind of spectacle projects. They were able to work with Riverside County here for doing a call to artists, which was a rotating exhibition, but also a way for them to start gathering the names of local artists in Riverside County. They started doing parades, and in these events, people don't have a hard time going to cultural events. And as they're there enjoying themselves, they're able to talk about whatever they might be going through, or city needs that might be not met at the time. And so this became a really important way to kind of sort of strategize and to get community feedback outside of traditional methods. A third theme that really stuck out during the review of the 1,200 cases was looking at how people want to approach civic pride and community betterment or improvement. So in Alameda, California, in the suburban Bay Area of Oakland, there was a project called Rhythmics, and Rhythmics was looking at music and dance. It's a newer project from 2020, also $75,000, so it wasn't a lot of money, but they had an old building that they needed to repurpose. It cost a lot of money, and they were worried whether or not they would have enough people to be able to use it to rent it out. It was a venue for art in terms of a gallery space, but it was also a venue for performance. What was interesting for Rhythmics, it was they saw the value of a unique space that wasn't about tearing it down and building something new. And they were trying to balance this with indoor and outdoor gatherings. But they also saw that the value of this would bring out all these people in this region that weren't living in San Francisco specifically, but had moved to this area for the social networks they had with the changing demographics there. And they wanted to present art forms that weren't shown in mainstream venues. And so this became really important with different African traditions and Latino traditions and Asian traditions and tribal traditions, that people would come to this space because you could not find this in other parts of the Bay Area, which made it a destination even outside of the residents there. Another project here, this one funded by HUD, this was a larger project, $350,000 for civic pride and community improvement. And this one looked at multidisciplinary work here, but it had a whole number of stakeholders, a whole new plan that they were doing in a group called the Fairfield Alliance, the university, the health department, the development corporation, the school district, the police department, and the local foundation. And the area of Huntington, West Virginia here is very autocentric and very spread out. But as they started doing a plan update and they started sort of doing what we used to do in person, people started getting ideas about what's good, what's bad, right? And so, sort of an asset-based approach, at least with the what's good part, right? Where people were going, where people spend their time, but also the things that maybe were negative sort of lens of the city. What they discovered in this is, especially as they worked with youth, the importance of one house that actually really needed to be preserved here, the Memphis, Tennessee Garrison House. And this became sort of a place in a cultural center that in a city that didn't have them before or didn't have one before. It got the attention through the Historic Preservation Fund and the African American Civil Rights Program here. And so what was really important here is the momentum. It actually started a whole new group of organizations here that were really interested in this kind of work. And so it showed them the importance of being able to identify cultural assets, actually taking that early time, and new form of activism in that people wanted to preserve their history, especially people who may not have felt more visible in the city as before. A fourth theme that really stuck out here was preserving culinary traditions and the connection to health. This is in Covington, Kentucky, and this is in suburban Cincinnati. It's just right over the state line. And a group called the Center for Great Neighborhoods of Covington in 2019 got $100,000 to look at this building here, this sort of at one point an abandoned industrial building, and sort of rethink the role of community agriculture. And so food-based businesses there, is there a culinary kitchen, a commercial kitchen? Are there workshops to teach people there? And look at the importance of passing down. A lot of times, a lot of the culture in our own houses is being passed down from traditions in the kitchen. A similar project too here was also in Gaithersburg, Maryland, in suburban DC here. Community Science Group wanted to do a lot more work with community gardens as well. And so they didn't have a specific building. They were doing a lot of their work outside with this rotating mural and looking at the indigenous and sort of ecological connections people might have to different plants, medicinal plants, these kinds of things. And this didn't cost that much to kind of set up these beds and do that. But the amount of people that we're able to bring actually showed sometimes the importance of the process being more important than the product itself, which is a big lesson in creative placemaking. Um, and then a final theme to kind of go through is just looking at how artists in suburban areas started looking at community-based partnerships. And so this is in New Brunswick, also a connection to some of the fresh low work that was happening in Kentucky as well. And this was a group that was looking at theater and music in 2015. And they wanted to work with some of the faith-based groups in the area. And so they started working with several immigrant artists to develop some murals in areas that had been blighted. And these murals would change over time. And so in some ways, this area didn't have a local history museum or anything like that. And many times that's where cities will say, oh, John, I don't think we can get this off the ground because we don't feel we have the anchor we need. And I'm like, oh, no, no, no. You don't need all of those other things. It's great if you have them, but it's not necessarily the thing that holds everything together. And you'd be surprised how many people want to kind of come out and do work outside of a specific wall or building. And so what I'll do is now is just sort of wrap up with just some general key lessons for Eastvale as you think about sort of the suburban area and that change there. And the reason why this is so important is because a lot of attention has been spent on really, really urban areas, and it's a whole different set of needs and interests. I used to go to many conferences, and as we did that, we would sometimes gather and people were like, oh, it's a placemaking conference. And people would say like, okay, this is for people who do work on murals, and this is people who do like want to do performance placemaking. And we'd sit like in a circle with 20 people, and someone says, I'm from New York, and someone says, I'm from rural Iowa. And I was like, oh, the learning here might not be as good as we imagine it to be because the scale is different and the resource provision is different. And so in thinking about some early steps as we move forward, and during the Q&A in a bit, when the audience is able to sort of interact some more, I'd be happy to kind of go through some potential projects or brainstorming or seeing how things might work if there are ideas you might have. Some early general steps, and I've been thinking a lot about this. Is the role of arts and culture and creative placemaking in the general plan in Eastvale an integrated or a separate sort of part of the element, right? Sometimes people will do an extra plan and it's just sort of an addendum, but they'll sort of figure out where to center that. Other times art and culture is sort of written throughout the whole plan, and it's not sort of another chapter and a different part of that or a different document altogether. Um, in the span of creative placemaking, a lot of people used to focus on artist housing or the importance of cultural districts and gateways. And I would say that's really important to think about here, but more important is even small scale kind of looking at arts and culture really broadly and being able to think of even whether or not there are planning grants to apply to that might get you thinking about maybe an asset-based approach to this work in Eastvale. There are a lot of consultants I can think of who do this kind of work, meeting with community members, even on Zoom, trying to kind of break down where that vision can go for a general plan. And so also kind of thinking about non-traditional partnerships, as we saw in some of the examples, and I've got other ones I've left that I didn't get to go through today. There are a lot of non-traditional matches in the police department being the lead agency for different grants, in the connection to youth and social services, faith-based systems, right? Many times groups will, and especially cities, small cities, will think about economic impact more important than anything else. And we're used to doing the economic impact reports for the arts, but for Americans for the Arts and some of the other standard ones. But I would say the arts, centering the arts before centering the economics actually will solve that problem. Just the creative placemaking role actually leads to so many other kind of great byproducts in economics. And I've got a lot of other resources I can share for anyone who's interested in that. Some specific early steps to kind of think about when residents or the city is thinking about how to write this into the general plan, but also how to think about this in terms of any specific projects you're getting off the ground. Is the project permanent? Is it a sculpture? Is it an actual building? Or is it temporary? A sculpture that's only there for 2 weeks or 2 months? Something that might be light-based or ephemeral? Is it a festival or parade that's a yearly event, but then it sort of goes away and everyone looks forward to it later? Thinking about really small scale is actually really great, whether that's a specific intersection or corner, and starting there. These actually provide some of the best immersive experiences in my experience with creative placemaking. Um, with Eastvale being an area that has so many changing demographics, I know someone at USC who has talked a lot about Eastvale and how it's becoming the place a lot of upwardly mobile middle class families are moving to, Asian, Latino, African American, into the Inland Empire, and I think that's really important. So it comes up a lot. It's how I sort of found Eastvale many years ago, in thinking about the project I was working on. But there's some ways to think about multicultural where we can say we have a really diverse growing city, but everyone kind of does their own thing, or intercultural where we say we're able to mix all of that, and these creative placemaking projects that we're proposing are actually going to connect with different groups because we want to see what that learning is. And I can think of many projects that have done that. Thinking about clear outcomes and incentives has been very important. Many of the creative placemaking projects that I've seen in smaller areas have been, have maybe not succeeded when there's been a different value set, where the artist might be more interested in sort of doing work to showcase their art, but less interested in the community transformation, which is what I know the general plan is looking to do in a very big way with many different sectors. You know, who's the lead on the project? Is it the artist? Is it an arts organization? Is it the city? And finally, really thinking about how to translate that story. I think people who are artists and creatives are really wonderful people who get so wrapped up in the project, I think sometimes we forget to stop to tell the story. And we have lots of great visuals and photos and videos and all these things, and we stop short of celebrating the things we were trying to preserve. Underlying all of those lessons is really this key question of how can creative placemaking strategies, how can they be additive to existing work, and not necessarily thinking about them in terms of something that might take a lot of energy or time. After 20 years of this work, I think someone said, you can do so much with a can of paint on an intersection. And I think about this statement a lot because, and it's not for not giving large art grants. I've helped to give a lot of those, and I've read hundreds of these applications. And so I can tell a good grant from one that maybe might need more work or might not be ready. But my sense of where Eastvale is going is there are all these things sort of coming together, and there's sort of this nucleus now there of trying to center that and strategize that, and whether that becomes, an expanded art in the park program, or, an events program, or Eastvale starts thinking about, the different cultural traditions that might exist there in an artist roster, using some of the maybe even city spaces, starting an art collection that might be more digital in some ways or light-based. There are lots of ways to go here. And so and just to wrap up, for everyone who's watching this at home, take a moment to think of an area of arts and culture. Is it film? Is it dance? Is it performance or theater? Just think of one of these. The first one that comes to mind is usually the one that maybe you like the most. And now think of a specific place in Eastvale, whether that's an intersection or a street or a specific building or park. Now with those two things, a type of art, practice, and a specific place in Eastvale, you can fill in the blanks. After seeing the Eastvale Clear Vision series presentation on creative placemaking and suburban change, I'm left with a lot of ideas on how arts and culture can support the Eastvale 2040 General Plan update. Specifically, I would like to see the ways the general plan can focus on dance in this part of Eastvale. So think about that, and maybe during the Q&A, if anyone wants to reveal that. This may be a very uh, easy entryway into really thinking about what values people have and what kind of artwork they might want to see and those types of things. And I think these types of exercises become really critical early on, and to be able to make that connection, because these general plan updates, as we're looking at Eastvale 2040, that means the next 20 years, this is really the vision for what we want to see there. And I can see from that word cloud, people are really bursting at the seams to kind of see something come together where it could be a gathering space for residents of Eastvale and for people outside of it. So I'll stop here and I'll open it up to Q&A for anyone who has any ideas, projects, or other things they'd like to talk to me about.
Great. Well, thank you, John. That was a great presentation. And we have about 20 minutes or so for Q&A. So I want to go ahead and open it up now for anyone who has a question. They can post it on the Q&A session. Just type it in there, or if you want to raise your hand, we'll go ahead and call on you and you can ask your question that way. So I will go ahead and open it up now. See if anyone has any questions. Let's see here. Not seeing any raised hands. Here we go. We have one raised hand. So Keith White, let me see. Hi, Keith. Can you hear us?
Can you hear me now?
Yes, go ahead,
Okay,
Keith.
I have a problem. Hey, there's one thing I would like to see in Eastvale with the arts and stuff, especially music, because music will help kids. If you know, there's a lot of music now in schools right now. Their programs have been cut. And another thing I would like to see is maybe we can have local talents from our Eastville residents who play music and stuff, being in the parks and stuff, when we have our concerts and stuff. That's one thing I think we need to look into, because I've known people that sing. I mean, I met a couple of Eastville residents, but that's something I like to see is more music and more concerts in the park and more different types of music. You know what I'm saying? That's one thing that helps me out, and I think we need to have that. And also maybe these fairs have art displayed at these concerts in the parks and cultural different food trucks. Learn background about the food and stuff. I remember one time I had this was a transit agency. I had gone on a tour in the city of Paris where they actually built a garden and learned about people cultures. This is in the city of Paris, California, with the new housing, all that. I was on tour and it was amazing what I learned. But that's one thing I would like to see is more music in the city of Eastville when we get back to regular, no COVID. Thank you.
I think that's a really great point, Keith. Are you a musician, Keith, yourself, or do you know musicians in Eastvale?
Actually, my roommate is actually he produces bands. He is promotes bands and stuff. So he has a business called Syngin Music. So he promotes bands, local bands. He has a couple people covers called Sticks Band. He knows the band leader there, so he has a few contacts. So yeah, I live with a guy that promotes bands.
Sure.
And he knows his music big time.
What's important about what you're saying too is that, as we think about the general plan update, a lot of times where we're thinking like, are we proposing like an actual like venue? Is there a new concert venue? Are we trying to say that the general plan update will have more elements of like urban design that will have like more flexible like performance spaces? And I've thought a lot about this in parks because many times it'll be hard for municipalities to maintain that, right? Or they'll say, oh, we're not sure how to design that. And so I've been thinking a lot about how we make things really flexible. And there's some really great examples of projects where it packs up really nicely, like it's almost like a shipping container, and then you're able to remove all the walls, and then it's this instant sort of setup, and it's a stage, but you can roll it out. And so something like that doesn't cost as much money. They did a lot of these projects in Arkansas and in Alabama, and it's really great. It's just this beautiful thing that opens up. Different artists will change the facades of it, and so people will go, and then you can move it to different parts of the city, and being able, and part of that actually is a creative placemaking project too, because it's created together, so people are building that together. I think there's something to be said also about the different sort of music traditions people are looking for too, right? And so as Eastvale starts exploring more and more what those assets are, right, you'll find a whole range of music, right? And you can find, I remember one story in a suburb of Miami where someone played a specific kind of like Haitian music that they only knew in this region. And I'm like, I've never heard of this. And I follow music a lot myself, a lot of world music stuff. And so it was interesting to see that. And the neighbors would say like, no, there's just very few people who do this. It's this person. And in my mind, in the way I think, I thought, I hope the city knows that, but I hope the city is doing something to celebrate that person. And if this is the last person who does this, or the last few people in this family, how do other people get to learn that as well? And so, the food truck element too, I think is really important too, because many times we see the food truck connection as just sort of a commercial additive to sort of a larger festival. And, we'll go to festivals, we'll eat, and we'll see music, we'll see things like that. But how could you also make that, especially with a lot of Southern California's great culinary tradition, to be able to teach people certain things? And so we've seen that a lot with like Korean tacos and other things, and people all over the United States will say things about like food trucks. And I'm like, oh, but Southern California really was doing this many years ago, and these fusions are not mistakes. And so there's a lot more to say there about what we can kind of do with placemaking and food and that connection.
Great, thank you. Thank you for that question, Keith. We do have a question that was submitted, and this is from Michael Rochelle, and I'll go ahead and just read it out. Have you seen any cities place musical instruments in public areas such as a piano in a common area? If so, how do they handle maintenance, etc.?
Sure. Yeah, so that was actually a big movement maybe 7, 8 years ago. And so people would put out, there's one city to look at, Port Angeles, Washington. And they started putting out different pianos. And it was a small city, it had a little downtown area. And it got a lot of tourism because it was near the Olympic National Peninsula. And I had asked that question too, because I thought, part of my job many years ago with a lot of these grants, um, the government or these foundations, I spent months doing this and it was my favorite job. People would say, would you go review grants that we already gave and just see how they're doing if they need any help? We won't be able to tell you so much in advance where you're going. So I'm like, oh, cool. So then, I mean, I would just get an itinerary and it would be like, okay, you're going to Miami tomorrow. I'm like, okay. And then that night you're flying to Lawrence, Kansas to talk to like some poets who do like beatnik poetry. And then you're going to Port like Angeles and you're looking at the piano project. And then you're going to like, rural Minnesota. And I'm like, whoa, this like wild. Every day was something different, right? And it was a really fun job because I think I got a good sense of what was happening across the country. And I would see these piano projects all the time. And in my sense, they would end up getting more used pianos. And so they were usually donated by churches that maybe didn't need them. They got tuned maybe once every few days, but not that much. And most of the people who actually were playing them actually knew how to play piano. I never heard of a story of anything getting defaced, but what I would see people do is just because it was an older piano and they knew that there was a risk of potential defacement, they would just paint the piano constantly. And so like they'd have different children groups come over from the local schools and paint them. And one day it was like yellow with butterflies, another day it was just all orange or pink or whatever it was that they were trying to do. Sometimes they had like messages they would write, or people would come in and like write their messages. And so in some ways they actually use the piano as its own piece of artwork as well. And it allowed for people who didn't necessarily know how to play piano interact with that, and they were placed strategically. Some of these cities had 2 or 3 of them at one point, all across. And so yeah, if Eastville had access to something like that, and then the piano, it's much easier than the other ones. I never saw it work with other musical instruments that usually did walk off, but it's harder to walk away with the piano. So but yeah, but I've seen that actually go well.
Great, thank you. Let's see if I know there's a call-in number here and I want to allow that person if they have a question because they wouldn't be able to raise their hand. But phone number ending in 1342. I'm gonna go ahead and allow you to talk. And if you have any questions, go ahead and ask them. If not, then don't talk. Do you have any questions? Okay, doesn't sound like it, but I just wanted to give that person an opportunity to ask a question if they had one. Let me see, do we have any other questions here? I'm not seeing any raised hands and I'm not seeing anything in the Q&A box. So
Are there
I do have a question I do want to ask you. We are in the process of looking into developing a public art and public spaces ordinance. And so do you have any recommendations on developing a program like that?
Right. When I worked for the LA County Arts Commission, we were just starting a Percent for Art program, and I had worked before for the Department of Cultural Affairs for the City of Los Angeles. I wasn't in the public art department there, but we had a very robust program. And then I started seeing many cities actually start trying to figure out how to do that. Sometimes it was the Transportation Authority in LA, so it was Metro. They had a really robust one too. The first thing I would say is really think about what kind of percentage you're looking for in terms of the capital improvement percentage. Most cities are doing like half a cent, others are doing like a full cent or like more in terms of the percent for public art. It really ranges these days as there's been such a big building boom. And I think where Eastvale is with so much growth, it becomes a way where you say, if you're building anything in the area, we're going to get a certain percentage of that, in the same way that cities will take some of the tourism money with the lodging tax, and then they'll just apply it. It's actually how the City of Cultural Affairs Agency in LA is funded. We just get a small portion of the occupancy tax from hotel taxes. And that's why everyone, when they say, "Oh, we don't want to pay hotel taxes," I'm like, "No, no, no, you're helping the arts. It's okay, it's okay." Like, and so, so the first thing would be to think about what that percentage is, and my sense would be that you might have a lot more that you can run with there in terms of that becoming a trust fund. The second thing is, a lot of times when I worked for the county, I managed our Art in the Parks program, which was mostly like musical events all across the county. And when we would have sometimes community benefits or some of these percentages for art, what usually cities think about is, okay, the developer for this one project gave a certain percentage, and then we need to use that percentage, the money used, we received from that on that project, on that one corner or that one building. And so they'll think about doing like a public plaza or a sculpture in front of a commercial building. What what is a new trend more recently, and I think this is actually much more flexible, is setting up a trust fund and saying, hey, it's totally fine if we got the development from the east side of the city, but it all went into a trust fund, and it'll help other parts of the city too. That way, it actually kind of helps distribute some of the resources for arts, especially in a smaller city. And so, what I've seen happen there is I've seen cities say, we're going to actually scale up our Art in the Park program, or we'll start a theater in the park over the summer, and all these things. And so, and it's not just the fixed thing, and it's fine if it's changing over time. And so, and then the third thing I would say is kind of the types of public art that you would want. There are accesses to rosters with the California, State Arts Agency, the California Arts Council. But one first step for City of Eastvale may be actually starting to pull together, in any other surveys you might do on the general plan, or access to. So like Keith was saying, right, he's got a roommate that's a musician, being able to sort of make a list and say, oh, okay, wow, we have a lot of this type or that type, because it may turn out that some of the public art will be really fixed in terms of their like really cool mosaics or murals, but the role of like some of the digital artwork, or even like the artificial like AI kind of artwork, is starting to gain a lot of momentum, and not in a scary way, in a like, wow, I guess this is the future in sort of how people are using their phones to interact with art. And so I would say, going back to like some of my key lessons, thinking about artwork really broadly, because I think what happens with cities starting public art programs, percent for art programs right now, is that they might be limited to thinking about sculptures and things like that, which is no problem. But I would say it's even broader than that, and that would be actually really fun. I think that would, you're at an interesting time with everything changing, and I think with people coming back from COVID, wanting to have more sort of art making experiences. There was one project in the suburban Nashville area that had an artist develop a mosaic for a city building, but the placemaking part there was the process where over 6 months the studio was open, the city got a grant, they paid for some of the time and materials, and over like 600 people came and did one piece of the mosaic and told a story, and that story was archived, and it became another art project on the side of that building, with pennies looking at people's different family histories and immigration routes. And it was like this fantastic project, and they did it for such little money, but all they do is can talk about the amount of people that came and still looking for that kind of connection, rather than just the ribbon cutting saying, oh, someone did a mural and you'll
Right.
see it and it's pretty, but we didn't have a connection to it.
Right. Great. No, thank you for that. We do have
One
one
question.
question.
One more question, and then make one.
Yeah, I do have one more question from an anonymous attendee. And on the subject of repainting the piano, have you seen the same solution of consistent repainting be done to walls of a building? How would you go about the idea of regulating graffiti versus beautification?
Sure. Yeah, this one's a big one. And so what has been a big finding in a lot of the mural work happening these days is people have found that if a community is involved with creating the mural, it's less likely to get defaced. And if it is defaced, then wait, is this the question about graffiti? Okay, sorry, I got a question. If it is defaced, it's probably not someone from that local region. And I didn't believe this at first until I started reading more reports about public safety and community abatement. And I worked with a group in Los Angeles that did this, and it seemed more and more true. And one way to think about this, that if you did have a large mural project that did get defaced, is thinking about the amount of times that mural might change, right? And so it would be really sad to have spent a lot of time or money on a mural that then is defaced within, like, 2 days, and that would probably be an easy fix. There are a lot of good clear coatings that can actually remove that, and so a good power washing, actually can fix that a lot. But I think that part there probably goes a lot more to the process too. It's like the Mosaic project that I mentioned before that was called Migrations in suburban Nashville area. What is interesting about this is people might not even feel as bad if there was a defacement, if they actually spend a lot of time helping with the artist selection. And so what you might find here too is, the process of maybe establishing a rotating group of jurors within the city. Some of them might be artists and have an arts background, or some of them might just be really interested in art without the arts background, but have lived there for a while, or can, have a way to articulate a vision. For people participating in the survey that you'll get, there's a mix of questions after the presentation that will actually try to pull some of the information about the things you're looking for in Eastvale and how to approach that. And I think it's the reason why I spent a lot of time thinking about how we define creativity and art, because the minute we open that box up so broadly, it's really so many things. It's not necessarily everything, but it allows for a bigger imagination. And I think I spend more time telling cities that it's like, oh, it could be that, like, that's fine what you mentioned, but it could be this too. So I look at it as a this and rather like this or that. And I think for people starting out now, you didn't have to go through all of the sort of eras of cultural planning that really were like, start a district, and then artist districts didn't have incentives for artists to move there. So we're like, we put up a sign, but artists are not here because it's so expensive. And they're like, oh yeah, we didn't build artist housing. And so all of that starts connecting. And that's why, like, the image behind me was a small project, a few $1,000s in Kennett Square outside of Philadelphia, in the suburban area in Philadelphia. And really cool project, just transformed this crosswalk that later transformed the way how fast people drove, turned into a public health thing, started making people feel there was more of a center in this part of area that had been sort of forgotten, started getting more murals in the area. And so it was the key catalyst to really get things going.
Great. Well, thank you. We are out of time, but I do have one more question that somebody brought up, and I want to make sure that they get their question answered. So this will be the last question from Michael Rochelle. Again, speaking of digital art, have you seen any augmented reality integrated with any artwork or sculptures in public spaces? That's an interesting question.
Yeah. It's the stuff I've seen now. It's starting more and more. And so there's a group in Santa Fe. I lived in Santa Fe for a bit, and it's called Meow Wolf. And they're really famous now, but they do all these immersive experiences. And so we're getting at, with the role of creative economies and creative people working on sort of new, we've got a younger generation who's like, we work for ourselves and this is what we do. So Meow Wolf took over this old abandoned alley, bowling alley, and they turned it into this weird sort of playground. It's really immersive and it's fun. And they've got one in Las Vegas now and one in Denver. It's an old water park. And so my friend Brian Corrigan in Denver works on these kinds of projects. He did this whole immersive arcade in Denver. It was a street that needed some life. He took over an old Radio Shack, and they did this big digital sort of game. And so you would put on the headset and everything, and you would be inside this little world. And it was this huge kind of format thing. The funnest thing about that, he brought it to Boston when I lived there, and he took it all over the country. the funnest thing about that was seeing people walk by who had no idea what was going on, and the amount of time they could spend in all of this kind of work, and how much fun they would have. And I would say, well, then that's the success of creative placemaking, that it wasn't even part of your intention, but you're running into all of these activities and like opportunities across the city. You know, it just happenstance. It's sort of, we go and we travel and we take a walk and we run into something, we'll buy an ice cream and we see, you know, someone playing a banjo, and like that's kind of what city life is, right? And so so Brian is doing a lot of this work, and I think we're going to start seeing more and more of it. So the projects I have, that one was called Oh Heck Yeah, and a really fun one, but you'll see more and more. That's
Love
that's
that.
a main good one, I think, for right now.
Great, thank you. Well, I think we're out of time now, so I definitely want to be respectful of folks' time. So thank you, John. Again, this was a great presentation, a lot of useful information, and I'm sure we'll put it to good use here in Eastville. So I'd like to thank you again on behalf of the City of Eastville City Manager and Community Development Director and the whole City Council. Thank you very much for your presentation. Really appreciate it.
Thank you everyone for attending, and thank you to all the city's staff for being here and for doing this for residents of Eastville. Again, I think it's a big win and a really great thing. And many cities I've worked with, I've never seen anyone take this time and effort to and resources to help their residents understand the general plan. So thank you, and please be in touch. I'll send the presentation, and happy to help in other ways too.
Great. Thank you very much, John. Just in closing, I want to again thank everyone who's attended all of these speaker series. They've been great. I've had a lot of fun hosting them, and kind of sad to see the end of it, but we are the last one, and so this will be the last one. We will send out a survey that will follow up this presentation, and as John mentioned, we'll provide some questions, and hopefully you can go on there and respond to them. But with that, I think we can call it a night. And again, unless Gina, you have any closing thoughts, we can go ahead and thank everyone and call it a night. Great. Thank you very much. Have a good evening.
Goodbye, everybody.
Bye.
Thank you.